Welcome back to our final session of the day. Please welcome our host for this session, Professor Stephen Ansolabehere, the Frank G. Thompson Professor of Government at Harvard University.
Thank you all and welcome back. This afternoon's session is starting off where Secretary Kerry left us off at that very local level. The question we've asked to organize this session around is, what can I do? At the end of this, where can we all become active, plugged in, and start to try to solve this problem at a very individual, very local level? And as we were thinking about designing this question and its answer, I came to my friend Marshall Gans immediately. Marshall is the Ruth Hauser Senior Lecturer at the Kennedy School where he teaches organizing. He has touched countless lives. When I talk to my students about their favorite course, the most impactful course that they've had here at Harvard, almost all of them who have taken Marshall's class say that's the class. So you're here to hear from Marshall, who has had a lifetime of experience organizing from Mississippi in the summer of 1965 to Cesar Chavez and farm workers, countless political campaigns, workers in Japan. His reach, his influence is astonishing, and he is going to lead a conversation with three very important leaders in various communities, Roxanne Brown, Brad Campbell, and Sam Sankar. Marshall.
Thank you, Steve. Is this on? If you can hear, raise your hand. Let's see. Oh, okay, great. Whoa, big space. So good afternoon. And I understand we're sort of the wrap-up here. So let's see how we can do, because there's been a lot of conversation, discussion. So first thing, I just want to introduce our panelists a little more fully. Roxanne Brown, International Vice President at Large of the United Steelworkers. She oversees the union's public policy agenda, as well as its political work, serves as a vice president of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, and was a founding steering committee member of the Blue-Green Alliance, and is a member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. She serves on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board. Please welcome Roxanne. Sam Sankar is Earth Justice Senior Vice President for Programs. Sam leads a program leadership team which develops Earth Justice strategy for carrying out the mission through litigation, lobbying, and regulatory advocacy, and communications. He clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, was an attorney in the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division, and was Deputy Chief Counsel of the Presidential Commission formed to investigate the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and also started out as an engineer, and has figured out how to blend the engineering and the legal work, which is a very interesting combination. Please welcome Sam. Brad Campbell. Brad is president of the Conservation Law Foundation, which, among other things, develops community advocacy programs in environmental justice communities, such as Lawrence and Chelsea. Former White House senior appointee during the Clinton administration, Brad was the regional administrator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Mid-Atlantic region, and served as commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Please welcome Brad. Now, I just want to start off with a couple of observations or a couple of thoughts. The first is that in considering challenges like this one, I found it very useful to be guided by three questions posed by the first century Jerusalem scholar Rabbi Hillel, who, when asked, how do I figure out what I can do, what I should do, responded with three questions to ask yourself. The first one, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Not meant to be a selfish question, but a self-regarding question, sort of a demand for enough self-awareness that you can actually see others. But the second question is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what, a human being and not a thing, is to recognize we exist in relationship with others in the world. Our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he asks this very direct question, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but it's a caution against what Jane Addams called the snare of preparation. Just another year of analysis, just another year of strategic planning. We'll have the perfect plan, then we'll implement it, and the world will totally conform to our expectations, except that never happens, does it? So for me, the interaction of these three questions are important. The relationship of self, the relationship to us, the relationship to now. And so I'd just like to start off by asking each of our panelists, so why do you care? Why do you care about this? Enough that you're devoting major portions of your time and effort to dealing with this challenge. Not why somebody should care, but why you care. Sam, you want to start us off?
It's a good question, and it wasn't on the script.
There is no script.
So I find that when I meet colleagues in the environmental world, there's usually an origin story for everybody. My origin story is rooted in being a latchkey kid and being told I could only watch PBS on TV, and that meant an awful lot of nature shows.
Where was this? Where was
This was in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And I grew up watching those things and appreciating a natural world that my parents, as immigrants to this country, really had not experienced, and was lucky enough to get the chances to be, as an immigrant kid, an outdoors person, and developed a love for the environment. That translated into a deep interest in the technological and technical aspects of protecting the environment as an environmental engineer. And then as an environmental engineer, I started seeing, as we all do, who get in, if you get in a little bit, you start seeing what needs to be done. And now what drives me is the tremendous human cost, both to my family and relatives in India and to us here as Americans and my children. So those are the things that drive me now.
Thank you, Sam. Roxanne?
You're just going to give the perfect answer and then turn to me? Thanks, Sam.
I stalled for like 2 minutes.
So I could think. Honestly, what drives me to this work is my members. Our union, the United Steelworkers, as our name suggests, we represent thousands of workers in the steel industry, but really in every single energy-intensive, trade-exposed industry that you can think of. And I've had 24 years to get to know my members and our members in all of those sectors deeply, and their communities deeply, and see the impacts that a lot of them who live in communities who are around industrial facilities have experienced, the impacts they've experienced as workers in terms of safety and health at their facilities, and the fear that so many of them have right now that their future is tenuous. And so for me, that's what drives me. I'm connected to it because this is a priority for our union, and then I started to understand and see what it means for so many workers really around the world, but for our union between the United States and Canada, what tackling this crisis really means and what it will require. So that's what drives me. And also I have a 6-year-old, and when I think about just what's happening right now and what her world might be in 30 years, I'm scared shitless. I don't know if we can curse. I'm a steel worker.
Oh, I know. The walls haven't quaked.
It comes with the territory. But I am about what her future looks like when she's a 44-year-old, right? And so those are the things that really drive me.
Thank you, Roxanne. Over to you, Brad.
I see this as the challenge of our generation, and grew up with, the heroes of the greatest generation, but also had the experience of seeing what happens when public officials and polluters aren't held accountable, and seeing the damage in communities that have been historically disinvested, typically black and brown communities that are hit first and worst by pollution, hit first and worst by climate change. So that really is what inspires me to be in this work. But I also think there's an enormous opportunity to lead at the community level to the regional level. And I think we're at that moment where, if not now, when? in terms of moving forward with action.
Thank you. No, thank you all. I want to frame this second question a little bit. In my experience and background, it seems like major change in policy and all that, seems to usually come as a result of some profound disruption. Maybe a war, maybe a depression, but more hopefully a social movement. And Dan Schlossman at Johns Hopkins wrote an interesting book called When Movements Anchor Parties, where he sort of shows that deep change rarely originates within, but rather from without. And this kind of dynamic pressure then influences parties, influences policies, and so forth. That's just my own perspective. So what I really want to explore is, where do you think the urgency is going to come from, or can come from, or how can we be part of it, to actually move this thing in a way that not now is when? We'll start with you, Brad.
Well, I think as people see the loss of life and limb from extreme weather events, it's going to be very apparent what this means, what climate change means for our future, but really our present. We're already seeing those impacts here today. And I think the urgency is ultimately going to have to come from people connecting that to the fossil fuel industry and holding them accountable. And that'll happen in many ways. It happens through civic engagement. Civic engagement in New England has left us with 5 out of 6 states that have strong emissions reductions mandates. It goes to the accountability at the community level in terms of communities that are fence line communities to fossil fuel facilities that aren't prepared for climate risks that the oil companies have known about for decades. And it comes about through other measures. And both Sam's organization and mine engage in extensive litigation to hold government officials accountable and also the fossil fuel industry accountable. And I think you're going to see, as both the civic engagement and the accountability work proceeds, you're beginning to see an erosion of the social license that the fossil fuel industry has. And litigation plays a major role in that. And we've seen in the United States historically that powerful corporations with popular products are very hard to rein in until their social license begins to decline. And you look, going back, of course, to tobacco, asbestos, all of these social ills that we ultimately regulated. But it took a chipping away, including by litigation was often the tip of the spear, and even more recently, opioids. You really no action by the FDA to address an epidemic of addiction and death until attorneys general banded together and held them accountable. And I think you're going to see that combination of civic engagement and erosion of social license working together to finally push the transition forward.
I hope that's the case. A number of years ago, I taught a course with Lottie Guinier at the law school where we were looking at the relationship of social movements and the law. And the cases we compared was Brown v. Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott and the role of the law in those two. With Brown, the law was the whole strategy, the litigation. And we're still struggling with Brown. In the Montgomery bus boycott, the law was part of a community-based strategy that actually shifted power and birthed a movement. And so I'm clear about alignment between litigation and people and communities and how those two can work hand in hand. I just think it's an interesting and important challenge. Do you want to respond or go on to Roxanne?
I'll give you an example of how that can work in tandem. Right here, just outside of Boston, in Everett, Massachusetts, ExxonMobil has a major oil terminal. Every projection of a Category 1 storm puts that facility underwater. We've seen in Irene and Katrina that the tanks at that facility are the type that collapse readily. So in Katrina, $500 million just for one small community that was inundated. Right along the fence line, houses are built right up to the fence line of low income, predominantly non-income speaking community. And even though ExxonMobil has known for decades, doing very good science about the risks of disaster that are presented to this community, they've done nothing to prepare that facility. And we worked with the communities that are immediately at risk to raise up that risk, but also in tandem with that, brought litigation to hold the company accountable under the law for failing to prepare that facility to these risks that are quite apparent, well documented, and so forth. So there are ways you can weave by highlighting the stories of communities like that are on the front lines. I think you can begin to build that movement even as you're using the law as a very powerful lever, but not the only lever.
Thanks. Oh, thank you for that. Roxanne.
I just wanted to add to that, but I was going to answer the urgency question. But you know, you're touching on a community that's very much my membership. We have about 30,000 members in the oil and gas industry, and those are their communities that you're talking about. And so, to your question about, you know, urgency and when does that urgency happen? I think it's already happened in a lot of the communities that have been impacted by superstorms. You know, so there's this kind of disconnect that people often have about industrial workers, oil workers in particular, and about whether or not they care about climate change. They care about climate change because our members in the Gulf can tell you what happened to their refineries during all the superstorms that we experience over a series of years, and how they go underwater and they're out of work for periods of time. They actually care about climate change. And we have a pool of activists in these communities that actually they want to hold those companies accountable to doing some type of action to reducing their emissions around climate change, right? There are other communities around the country where our members are experiencing drought, or their rivers and lakes that they fish in are no longer clean, or the animals that they hunt are becoming, you know, no longer prevalent in their areas, right? So I think the localization of this issue is what gets at the urgency for normal people. Right, this is where, you know, we're in the policy space. This is we're at Harvard, right? We're big thinkers. But for everyday Americans to really understand the urgency of this issue and to connect with it in a real way, in a way that hits hearts and minds, right? That's for everyday Americans what happens. It's the localization of the climate impacts that get at an urgency, and that's what we're seeing more of in communities where you wouldn't assume that people even care about climate change.
That's a real common misunderstanding, that climate change concerns are the concerns of wealthy, well-to-do, largely white, suburban, whatever audiences. If you do polling in this country, you will see that Black and brown communities are more concerned about climate change, more concerned about environmental issues in general, and that is because they're living them. It's very, very real. To add to what you two have said about this, one thing I'd point out is that our fossil fuel economy, we're all thinking about climate change here, but it's imposed terrific health and welfare impacts even outside of climate change. Not even outside, primarily, honestly, these days, outside of climate change. So if there's one dynamic I've noticed that's moved the environmental movement that I'm part of, it is the recognition that the industries that are most at fault for creating the climate risks that we've got right now are also the ones most responsible for creating tremendous human health risks and suffering in the communities that we've talked about, and that doing the right thing for the communities that have been overburdened by these industries is the right thing also for climate, and that these are coincident strategies, that it is a real movement because there is a real need to transition away from a fossil fuel economy towards a clean economy. It's not just a low carbon economy, it's a low sulfur dioxide economy, it's a low solid waste economy, it's low risk for everybody.
You know, it's interesting because it seems like a shift from how do we stop this bad thing from happening to something that works, as opposed to recognizing it's not working. And this could be an opportunity to change it. That's kind of what I hear, and I think that's an interesting perspective. But I just want to go a little deeper on this because, you know, we have massacres going on all the time. In local areas all over the country, people are getting killed on a regular basis. Nothing seems to happen. How to translate those horrors and the conditions you're describing into enough of a political force, or however you want to call it, to actually make that urgency real. What does it take? What does it take to put it together, to sort of call the question, I guess, is my concern. I don't have any answer to this. I just think this is something we need to really take very seriously because time's passing. Mm-hmm. Time's passing. Who has some thoughts they'd like to share on this?
Well, I think part of the challenge, apart from political tribalism, which we're suffering from generally, is a matter of distrust. And you mentioned the communities that are hit hardest by climate, but also care about climate, right, but also have deep distrust that, you know, the policy solutions for pollution of the last 30 years left us behind. They left us with the burdens. So if it comes to a carbon tax or cap and trade, some of the solutions that, you know, think tanks reflexively come up with, there's enormous distrust that, yeah, sure, you'll trade those polluting allowances and the coal plant in my neighborhood will keep operating. And I think the same is true for labor. Deep distrust that, sure, there are, you know, New England could be the Saudi Arabia of wind, and yes, there'll be a lot of jobs there, but they won't be my job. And how do we address that transition so that everybody sees that they're not going to be left behind as we go through what will be a transformational change in the economy and our energy systems in particular.
I wonder if it.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. This is the conversation, right, that is happening right now within the House of Labor. And you use the word transition, and for some people in the labor community, the phrase "just transition," which is, you know, every conversation around climate has included this phrase "just transition," but that phrase, some people describe as a fancy funeral.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I mean, but that's what people describe it as, because what we are living through right now is the industrial revolution of our time. I'm 44 years old. I did not live through the first industrial revolution. But we are living through. Don't date yourself. We are living through the industrial revolution of our time, and just as workers played a critical role, and the industries that my members work in played a critical role in that industrial revolution in helping to build this economy, workers should play must play a critical role right now with what is happening right now, including the existing industries. And I think where we have a lot of frustration is the jobs that exist now in a lot of the industries that my members work in: rubber, glass, chemicals, oil in the petrochemical industry, steel, aluminum, mining. All of those industries are critical for the moment right now. That's all the stuff that needs to go into the technologies. And those jobs, and this is to your point, pay a family-sustaining wage. The jobs that are being developed right now in clean tech aren't there yet. My members in the refining sector make $150,000 a year plus benefits, plus retirement security. It's the Saudi Arabia wind up here, but the jobs pay $60,000 a year. So this is the rub. And we want environmental sustainability. It's necessary. but workers deserve economic sustainability. And that is the question. And to your point, we get there with a suite of things, including technologies. And so for us, that's our just transition for our members, is how do we lean into technology to do everything that you described, but also mitigate carbon? How do we do that for the existing industries? Because that is a just transition. We don't need a funeral for 850,000 steelworker members. We need jobs. We need a future.
No, that's, yes, and I guess the question that comes to my mind is, well, what are we doing about it? And yes, I think you do it's an excellent description of what's at stake, but how does that turn into action? I'm wondering if trust, or whether it's more a question of hope. What I've observed in movements I've been involved in is there are the grievances, but what moves people to act is a sense of possibility.
Yes.
Not of certainty, but possibility. Oh, could be. I'm sort of a fan of a definition of hope Maimonides, 12th century scholar, had, which is that hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. Right. In other words, we live in a world where it's always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. It's unlikely we would elect a black man president of this country. 2007 happened. That sense between fantasy and certainty of possibility. And I'm wondering what we're doing to cultivate that dimension as well, because there's not change without risk and without cost. I mean, both are there. And certainly the movements I was involved in, people were taking lots of risks and were paying pretty high personal costs in order to generate the power, fundamentally, to shift things. And that's how this figures into it. I know it's been a challenge for how to make the important urgent just seems a real challenge to this movement, has been for a long time. But Sam, over to you.
I was going to say, I think the sense of urgency, if there's a couple of things that hearten me. People always ask me, what gives you hope? And there's a couple of things. One is that the conversation on climate, 5 years ago, we were still in denial. Denial was a plausible political strategy for, people were saying, well, I'm just going to deny it. That's my strategy for getting elected to office. That's not a plausible strategy anymore. And if you look at the arc of change in the way that we're talking about this issue, it is a good arc. The urgency is increasing. And if you talk to, how many people here have children under the age of 18, right? And those are complex conversations we've all had with those kids when they ask, what is it that you do all day long? And I have a 14-year-old and a 20-year-old, and there was a process where my daughter became awake to the reality of climate and environmental concerns. And she asked me an important question at one point. She says, we're cooked, right? It's not there's none of this is gonna really work, right? And I said, no. And I said exactly this, that the possibilities are there. We can do this. And don't worry about what the probabilities are, because you have to focus on the possibilities. Right. That's our job right now, is to focus on the possibilities and to bring those things true. So one of the things I would say to this group is to think carefully about how we're talking to the young folks and to take hope from them, because we had 3,000 applications for our 50 summer jobs for our 50 summer law clerk positions. The interest in this among young people is tremendous. The commitment is tremendous. And I think, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing many of the younger generation workers in there, they're looking for those offshore wind tower jobs. They're interested in that being the story that they tell their kids about the job that's putting food on the table.
Definitely.
And there's a political dimension of that, because Gen Z is going to the polls, and climate is a very motivating factor for most, and we've seen it change elections. I mean, as part of Joe Biden's coalition, as part of here in Boston, Mayor Wu's coalition, but there's also a little bit of a backlash when that generation is disappointed that results aren't immediate, because there is urgency with that generation, quite definitely.
I think that's right.
And there's also policy, right? So, to your point about the dynamic around climate changing, especially in DC, we now have the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So talk about opportunity. It's ripe with opportunity in terms of deploying clean tech and helping industry to kind of clean itself up and creating jobs and training the workforce of the future. It's a matter of, do we take it over the finish line, right? We have the words on paper, but how we actually implement that in a way that will truly effectuate change is the question.
Yeah, and many a slip betwixt cup and lip, as they say.
Right.
That's sort of the challenge in implementation. And it's, I guess, been my experience that unless there's enough power to see the implementation all the way through, just passing the law didn't get it. Especially where our government is structured, divides those two functions. So it's a tough one. I've been doing some work with Sunrise and also with March for Our Lives when they were, and there's no question about the energy and about the hopefulness and the willingness to take risks. But then how does that translate into the power that's needed to actually turn this into a reality? That's where I'm really pushing us.
I think it takes coalition. You know, I really do. I think it takes a lot of coalition and unlikely partners working together to try to drive something forward that works for everyone. You know, you think about an organizing campaign, right? A local organizing campaign. And Marshall, you could probably give us all a class on organizing. But today, when people are approaching organizing, they're coming up with community tables, right? And so they're pulling in Black and brown members of the community. They're pulling in the environmental community. They're pulling in women's groups. They're pulling in, you know, local colleges and universities. And together, they're talking about the campaign and they're looking at who benefits from, and organizing, I mean jobs. If we're looking at a facility to organize a union at that facility, we're looking at who in the community can benefit from those jobs and how do we make sure that those jobs are going to be good and what kind of training is going to be needed for those jobs. And that's where having that kind of college and institution at the college and university at the table is very helpful. But it's taking a global and holistic view and approach to a thing. That is how I think we kind of drive urgency and actually win the win. We've been using this overused in DC, win the win. But that's how we win the win, is if you have, you know, unlikely characters coming together to kind of drive the thing forward.
Go ahead.
Well, I think you need the global view,
Yeah.
but you also need local action.
Totally.
Most energy decisions that'll transform our system are actually going to be made at the state, local, and regional level. And that's where the activism is really going to come in, groups like Mothers Out Front. There is a lot and an increasing momentum behind that activism, but the elected officials are feeling it.
Yeah.
But I think they need, I don't think it's reached a tipping point where they're feeling it as much as they need to.
Yeah, it's a little chicken and egg thing here because, yeah, it's good for people to come together, but unless there's the urgency driving them to come together, it winds up being a discussion club.
The most powerful movements that we've seen, we have the benefit of Justice of having over 1,000 different partners and clients around the country, and when our attorneys are working with groups, what we look for is groups that have complementary skills, political power, organizing skills, communication savvy, moral force. And the groups that have that right now are community groups that are dealing with the impacts, the day-to-day impacts of a fossil fuel economy, and are saying, we were promised jobs or this or that, and we got some job, but what we got was a real degradation in our quality of life. Our communities are not what they were. We've been hollowed out by the industries. We're saying no to these things. We're saying we want to transition to a different kind of economy and a positive vision of the future. So I think that it's easy, sometimes if you feel a little worry, despair in circles of elites, go out in circles of regular folks, and you may feel differently because the movement is strong outside of these buildings. The worry is large here. The power is there.
You seem to be describing environmental justice
That's right.
struggles, and we don't hear that word that much. Maybe we need to hear that word more. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, at least in my organization, what I see as one of the most powerful dynamics right now is a recognition by the sort of legacy environmental movement that the environmental justice movement while it was forced to grow up itself and be quite separate from the mainstream environmental movement, a slow and awkward reconciliation of these movements is necessary and I think is happening. I'd like to think that we're working very hard on it at Earth Justice to drive it forward, but that is a powerful alliance and a necessary one, and it involves a recognition that the mainstream environmental movement largely failed the environmental justice world for a long, long time and has a lot of work to do to get back.
At a global level, too.
At a global level, absolutely.
No, I really appreciate that, because unless there's a certain kind of moral urgency, people don't seem to move that much. And that's what you're describing, I think. In other words, there's a difference between inconvenience and injustice. And it's when you cross that line, my dignity's at stake, my worth, my children's future is at stake, then we're talking something very different than I got to pay a little more money for something. And that's what I'm hearing. I don't know if I'm hearing what I want to hear.
No, I think that's spot on. And one of the difficulties is more affluent communities can insulate themselves more than lower income communities. There's already a phenomenon of climate gentrification where more affluent people move to the high ground, literally. And it's happened historically, and it's happening more now. And I think that's a critical part of that is how we, in the environmental policy world, when we present solutions, we don't often, the history is of not adequately looking at the distributional impacts. Mm-hmm. Who's bearing the costs, who's bearing the benefits. And I think you need to match the urgency with two things. One is a sense that everyone's going to get both benefits and burdens of different types, and that the world will be in on the other side is one we want to be in, and not. I mean, there's this balance of doom and gloom, and which is needed for the urgency part, right? But as too often people come away and think, well, if I recognize the urgency, I'm going to have to wear a hair shirt. They're going to take away my hamburger, and I won't be able to drive my car for the 15 minutes before I drown. And so it's you got to match the urgency with also that the place we're going is appealing one, a cleaner air, cleaner water, safer communities, exciting cars to drive, like an electric Tesla. There is that aspect of creating that, persuading people that they really want to get to that destination that we'll get to by addressing the urgent problem.
Where do you see that kind of imagination, that kind of imagining happening in a way that is accessible and real to people?
I see it in academics and in that younger generation, actually. If you go around Cambridge, some of the most exciting work in clean tech is being done right here. And you're increasingly, and wherever I go in any kind of clean tech context, the youngest, the best, and the brightest are all at work on these challenging issues, coming up with new solutions, because we still don't have all the solutions we need. And I think that energy of finding a solution in time to make a difference is increasing, particularly among the youngest cohort, which are also going to be increasingly the voters who are going to determine elections.
It also needs to happen, though, in just normal, regular communities.
Not Cambridge.
Not Cambridge.
Right.
Not just Cambridge, right? Because there's a whole legion of young people who really care about this issue, and it's inspiring and amazing. But going back to how we kind of started this conversation, there are also a legion of people who do not trust anything that's being discussed at this symposium.
Right.
And for them, we are all against them. And that's a that's a BFD, right? And that's a piece of it.
That's not a special degree.
Yeah, I did not. It's another special degree, steelworker degree. But it is, and so for us, in the labor community, we are trying to do that, and we're trying to be the truth tellers and the hope dealers, if you will, in terms of what's possible. That's what we try to do through the Blue-Green Alliance, and really break it down and go into different communities around the country, and not just speak to steelworkers, but speak to members of the Service Employees International Union and auto workers, and plumbers and painters, right? So everyone kind of gets an idea about what is possible. So that's where labor is really important, because for workers, most workers, and there are all these polls that talk about this, most workers, and so I'm a vice president for the steelworkers. I have 850,000 members. My members won't trust me as much as they will trust their local union representative that is in their community. So it's that person that needs to be the one selling the hope and telling the story and doing the education and talking about why this is important, but also dealing in truth, right?
Yeah.
This is what is possible, but this also is what may happen.
It's and that can be a reaction of fear or anger.
That's it.
And anger can be very constructive. Not rage, but the dissonance between world as it is and the world as it ought to be,
Right.
if it's coupled with hope and not fear.
Right.
Because when it's coupled with fear, it goes the other direction. And so I'm curious about, in other words, there's so much focus today on messaging, how to message things. And I've always been puzzled by that, because it's one direction. And really interaction is really where understanding lies, I think, a lot more. It's confusing a marketing strategy with an organizing strategy. And they're fundamentally distinct. And so we have so much what's sending the message. My experience has been that people become hopeful when they experience hope. In other words, that something shifts, that they have an experience, that they're engaged, that they're involved. They begin to sense, oh, could be. Because we do all have those experiences in our lives when things turned out, oh, that happened, or somebody believed in us and surprised us. And so there are these resources, but unless they're coupled with forms of action and engagement and activity, it seems like the risk we run is to fall into the messaging stuff, which I don't think goes nearly deep enough or far enough, because it's not coupled with action. So I'm trying to push on the action part and seeing. I'm curious about the groups you're describing, Sam. Could you pick one or two? Just
Sure. I saw Sharon Levine's name on the invitation list for this, and the organization she founded in Rise St. James and St. James Parish. This is the sort of organization that we talk to our supporters about, to say, if you want to get hope, don't talk to earth justice attorneys. That's a thing you can get hope from, but really talk with the partners and clients that we've got on the ground who are making the change and are creating a vision for a future, an economic and cultural future that is free of the grip of the oil and gas industry on the Gulf South, that involves restoring an area of the country that used to provide for people in so many ways, besides as essentially a large chemical factory for the country. So I think that the advice that I have for people in the room is, if you're feeling concern or despair or just worry, open up your lens. You will find the power outside of the silo in which you live. That every time I find myself worried or concerned for the future, it's because I'm sitting there staring at my own Excel spreadsheet or my own board report or my own thing that I'm doing inside of the organization. When we consider the broader network of change makers out there, whether it's Sunrise or the Environmental Defense Fund or Louisiana Bucket Brigade or whoever else, that's when the power becomes there, and you see the change that they are making on the ground, and you get hope.
And you may even enter into relationships with people who are doing that.
That's one thing. Just something of an editorial comment. in order to partner effectively with organizations that are unlike you, you have to be comfortable with being with people who are unlike you.
That's right.
And that can be across educational, socio-political, racial, cultural boundaries, and that's a real challenge for any kind of organization, regardless of whatever piece of it you come from. You have cultural mores and personal attributes that necessarily make it hard for you to deal with other kinds of groups. So breaking out of that requires hard work and sometimes very, like actual painful self-reflection to say, where is my organization from? What are we composed of? So changing your organization can be the key to partnering better with outside groups.
Amen to that. I mean, I'll just quickly say amen to that. The Blue Green Alliance table has been a difficult one because even though, we have kind of a unified overall purpose and goal, the conversations have been difficult for us to understand each other across blues and greens and the natural tensions that have existed for time immemorial. But it's been so impactful because it helped us to get to the IRA.
What I've observed is that, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it also means sharing leadership
Yes.
at the community level, not riding in on a white horse,
Right.
whether from academia or from organizations like ours and saying, we have the answer, but having essentially a shared leadership model, which often means, yes, we're going to help you organize around shutting down the coal plant, but we also have this other local concern that we need your help on, and making it more of a shared leadership model.
It's been my observation that issue-based organizing often becomes very fragmented, very isolating rather than unifying. And so what we've tried to do is move to a values base. And that requires doing relational work. That requires engaging around what is it that we do share. And this may sound, like soft stuff. It's not. The deep canvassing was developed by the gay movement in Los Angeles after they lost Proposition 8 to go into precincts where they had lost, but not by arguing the issue, but by forming the relationship and putting the issue in a relational context. Because we're not defined by issues. We're human beings, and we're complex. And to allow ourselves to be defined by an issue. And I have to say, it's also fueled by the competition for funding, because so many of these groups exist because a donor thinks they should exist. And so then there's all this competition over that. So I think how to get to the ground, what you're describing, I think is spot on. The question, how to get there. And we've been working in our classes on how to cut below, go deeper, so that there is more of a recognition. Yeah, you don't have to be a tree person and I'm a fish person. We both care about the natural world. Now let's choose our issues strategically rather than getting stuck on it. I think it's a major challenge, but it's also a possibility. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that's right. And there are a lot of places where there is no community organizing around these issues. And one of the things we've found, and which we've never had in this organization before, with community organizers, under the roof, going to organizations that are formed around local threats, around lead poisoning or other issues, and broadening their horizon and helping to create a broader infrastructure of organizing that'll be more inclusive.
Yeah, it has to go. That's where the narrative work we do. I mean, that's why I started off asking you about why you care, because that's where there is a lot of common ground. But we have to be willing to do the work to allow ourselves to be seen, to see others, enough that we can build that kind of a relational foundation. It's often what movements do. I think that's one of the big challenges we have right now, is to do that. And I'm seeing that we're supposed to now have Q&A. Is that right? Yeah, this has been very rich, very interesting. Let's just open up for Q&A, comment, disagreement, challenge, whatever. But it is helpful to have things end with question marks.
Yeah,
where are the mics? There will be mics somewhere.
So there's one there.
Now, I know there's got to be some answers out there. Come on.
Roxanne, my name's Terry Smith. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School, live in Cambridge. Roxanne, I appreciated that most of your comments were around us, that we're doing this collectively. So I'm going to take a shot at Brad, who started off by talking about litigation over tobacco, paint, oxy, and Grace Chemicals. We're where we are now because of stuff we did. And I think that's a false analogy, picking the tobacco industry or OxyContin, because we wanted jobs, we wanted mobility, we wanted heat, we wanted light, we wanted food, we wanted, a salad in January in Massachusetts, so the trains had to come out. I just want to, so my question at the end of this is, how do we, you're a litigator, Conservation Law Foundation needs to have bad guys and good guys. How do we make it clear to all of us that we're all in this on both sides? We're all good guys and we're all bad guys.
A small question, yeah.
This is, I get this question a lot. And when it comes to certain industry sectors that have deceived the public for decades, I think there are bad guys. I think the tobacco industry, which suppressed the science, was a bad guy. I've actually gone through a transition. I was a public official, radical incrementalists. Fossil fuel industry has to be part of the solution. They have to be part of the table. Shouldn't be demonizing them because we need them, their leadership. And that might have been the right attitude 30 years ago when companies like Shell were very accurately predicting where we were going to be in terms of extreme weather if they didn't change the marketing of their products. Very presciently described the changes that they would need to make to transition off of fossil fuels and how urgently it was needed. There are reports from the 70s and 80s that are as urgent and accurate as the most recent IPCC report on those issues. And when you look at, particularly after Citizens United, when you look at the stranglehold that those companies have on our politics, yes, we all contribute to climate change by our lifestyles. Consumption is a big part of it, absolutely. And we do need to work together, but we also need to recognize that that's part of the fossil fuel industry's game, is to put it back on all of you to say, oh, as individuals, you're responsible for this broken system, when in fact they've held their stranglehold on public policy and blocked solutions that have been on the table for 30 years. So I definitely take your point. I always welcome people taking a shot, but I think the acceptance that that industry deserves to essentially be treated as one of the good guys, or that has the potential to be a good guy, I think is naive at this point, given the conduct we've seen.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I couldn't agree more with what Brad said. I mean, I've been a executive at a Fortune 5 company. I've done my time on the private sector as well. I'm sorry when a industry simultaneously suppresses science and then lobbies and spends vast amounts of money to distort political systems and regulatory systems to create subsidies and entrench itself. And I'm not at the same table. I may be at the table with the workers who are looking for a long-term financial security, but with the captains of industry who are telling me that, oh, I've got a plan for the transition, you don't ask the people who dug you into the hole how to get you out of it. We can think carefully about the costs of our society and how we're going to do that transition. But I'm afraid the industry's track record on pushing for practical solutions has not been particularly great.
Roxanne, I can see.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I agree. They are rat bastards, the oil industry. I mean, straight up. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But whenever I hear often the narrative about we need to shift away from fossil fuels and close refineries and shut down, coal-fired power plants, and I just really, especially for the students in this room, as you are getting ready to go out into the world, remember the humans around that narrative. It's so easy sitting here in Cambridge to say, oh, those industries are terrible, they're awful, they've lied. They have. But at the same time, they've also provided a livelihood for communities. I will give you an example. The Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery is in Philadelphia. It's old refinery. Bruce Springsteen even sang about this refinery in an old song. And it was, on the radar of the local environmental community in Philly for a long time because they did a terrible job of installing any pollution control technologies whatsoever in this facility. They failed the community, this company did, and they failed our members who worked. We had 600 steel workers working at that refinery. There was a fire at that an explosion a few years back, and our members quite literally saved that refinery. They ran towards the fire because had they not, the entire, multiple city blocks would have been gone, which again speaks to the danger of some of these facilities. But that facility ultimately closed because of that fire. And what went with it were livelihoods for the workers, but also tax base. I said that our members make about $150,000 in refining, right? And those refining wages. Those wages go to schools, roads, hospitals. So we have to remember that it's not just about closing these facilities. There's a worker and human and community piece to these jobs that, especially for the students, I just want you to kind of hear and think about. It has to be a solutions-based approach. We can't just say, close them, and then offer nothing.
Well, Roxanne, I think that it's all humans that are involved here, humans to come as well as humans that are here now. Right. In Sweden, the approach is to protect workers, not jobs.
That's right.
And so I think, the challenge here is how to make these changes. In other words, I think it's a real dilemma because if you're there's the source of the problem, and then we need to get the source of the problem to somehow buy in, what's the quote about trying to destroy the master's hand with the house with the master's tools? That doesn't quite, it's a problem. But then it's also a problem that there is no commitment in this country to actually protecting workers in almost any way, and just protecting people. And so one of the challenges, and I think benefits of this whole climate challenge is maybe we can get back to those kinds of basics, because we've got a system that does not protect people, and it does not treat humans as humans. And so I think it's also the case that fossil fuel industry is profoundly responsible and culpable for this, but not as it's one thing to have moral outrage, it's another thing to do what's necessary in order to put them out of business in a way that lifts people's humanity, but doesn't take it away. And I think there's where some of the challenge is. But let's hear some more. That was a good question.
Thumbs up.
3 different questions, but quick ones, I promise. So my name is Pallavi Mande. I'm an environmental advocate working in the climate resilience space. So for Sam, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Justice 40 funding that we are all really focused on in terms of delivering for us what we hope it will in terms of directing our resources to the environmental justice and vulnerable populations just wanted to get a sense from you, like, do you see the regulatory and legal framework around this solid enough for that to happen, or do we still need to work at that? Roxanne, wondering, sorry,
Oh, sorry.
just three. Roxanne, just wondering how you perceive greening the workforce and green jobs, because we are all sort of thinking about that as the panacea, but clearly it's not. Finally, Brad, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how you're bringing the indigenous populations and the land back movement into fighting or providing justice to populations who are not necessarily part of that formal legal and regulatory environment.
Let me just say, we're supposed to conclude in a minute and a half.
Okay.
So I wonder if we could do this. I wonder if, taking those questions into consideration, I wanted to ask each of you for some closing thoughts with this. And then, of course, hopefully this just opens a pathway to much further conversation, discussion. So who would like to start?
I'll jump in and just say on the workforce question, there's a lot that is created between the infrastructure bill and the IRA and CHIPS in terms of jobs, opportunities, and potential, and training the workforce of the future. But there's a big question mark about what it means for manufacturing and the skill sets that are necessary for some of those jobs. And for manufacturing unions like ours, we don't have traditional hiring halls. So there's a huge workforce conversation happening about how unions like mine then partner with local colleges and universities to upskill for the jobs that are going to be necessary. And even thinking about what those jobs are, when you think about technologies like direct air capture, the hydrogen hubs, they're jobs that we don't know that we need yet. That will be coming.
The
Right.
bell is ringing.
Right.
And Sam, want to?
It was a great question. I guess on the Justice 40 initiative, I would say there's a tremendous amount of work to be done on both sides, both the side of the government to implement the programs in a way that communities can actually take advantage of what's out there, but also it's not enough just to build the systems. You have to teach people, educate people about what's available and how to take advantage of it. So it's in both sides.
Brad?
So taking those questions together, in a sense, one of the reasons why we have to approach this work with a lot of humility is because we have a past. There is a past. And for indigenous peoples, it includes being excluded from the table, as it does for all BIPOC communities. And that's reflected in our work in many ways, from working on wind farm siting to preserve traditional view sheds that are important to tribes, to working in the Maine legislature to restore tribal sovereignty. And it's that history that also haunts the Justice 40 funding, because the administration, as they should have, created this funding pool, but they don't have the infrastructure to really deliver it to Justice 40 communities. It takes a lot of infrastructure as an organization to get and manage and comply with all the red tape of a federal grant. And community-facing organizations can't do that. And so a lot of what we've been doing with our community-facing partners is, okay, how are we going to figure this out? How are we going to find a pass-through entity that can get that funding to the ground and to the communities that are supposed to benefit from Justice 40? So as Sam said, I think there is a lot of work to do, a lot of history to overcome, history of injustice and racism, and missteps in the history of protecting the environment. Because Roxanne's here, I'll tell this quick story, which is when I was a regulator, I headed the Mid-Atlantic region of EPA. a steel worker had my direct line. And I would come in to a message every morning that was as profane as a steel worker could get.
We try.
And he would basically, once he was in his cups late in the evening, he would pick up the phone, call the head of the EPA and say, goddamn, environmentalists took away steelworkers' jobs. And it was a long tirade. And initially it was annoying, and then I realized that was a reminder that we got that transition wrong. And I think about those voicemail messages now as a reminder of what we have to overcome and the mistakes we've made.
Well, it's interesting. I've been watching this clock, and it's going up now.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that works. Yeah, it's like we're getting more time. No,
I think
It's been red the whole time.
yeah, no. Look, there's so much more we could get into here. I'm sorry we had not more time for conversation. In the Kennedy School, you have to always ask what the takeaways are, and so I'd be really curious about that. But we'll have to reflect on that. And I just want to thank our panelists for a really wonderful discussion. It has not been an easy one, and I think this is not an easy problem. So it's appropriate. And I'll just go back to those questions I started with, because I still think they're the key questions. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? To be fully for myself, what does that really mean? And if I'm for myself alone, what am I? What am I? And if not now, when? We're facing a big now, folks. And we've got to figure out how to put the urgency, the courage behind that we need to really deal with this now. So thank you. Thank you so much.